Welcome to episode 39 of the Necronama.com. The story I'm about to relate has been told many times in many different ways, with very little proof of the reality of the situation. In the 1940s, a family living in Cottage City, Maryland, became the unwitting inspiration for the film we're about to discuss. Roland Doe, a pseudonym for the actual child in this case, was an only child and developed a bond with his Aunt Harriet, a spiritualist. Harriet introduced young Roland to a Ouija board when he expressed interest in it. Following Harriet's death, the family experienced strange noises, furniture moving on its own accord, and ordinary objects flying or levitating when the boy was around. The family turned to their pastor for help. He brought the boy to his house to observe him overnight, and additionally reported occurrences such as the family had described. The family was referred to a Catholic priest. According to the traditional story, the boy then underwent a number of exorcisms. During the first exorcism, the boy allegedly slipped one of his hands out of the restraints, broke a bed spring from under the mattress, and used it as an impromptu weapon, slashing the priest's arm and resulting in the exorcism ritual being stopped. With no idea what else to do, the family traveled to St. Louis, where two more priests visited Roland in his relative's home. They allegedly observed a shaking bed, flying objects, the boy speaking in a guttural voice. He displayed an aversion to any sort of Christian relics. The priests were granted permission from the church to perform an exorcism. During that exorcism, the three priests on hand reported words such as evil and hell, along with various other marks appearing on the teenager's body. Allegedly, the boy's mattress began to shake. Roland attacked one of the priests and broke his nose, but the priests eventually prevailed, seemingly driving the spiritual being out of the young boy's body. Allegedly, the young boy went on to live a rather normal life, although only those involved know for sure. Still, the story spread, and it eventually influenced William Blatty to write The Exorcist, a book published in 1971, and then to write the screenplay. From there, the story has worked its way into the psyche of modern America. We may never know the full truth of what happened to Roland Doe, but like so many stories, that only makes it all the more interesting. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now. And the scariest part of this movie was all the flashbacks to going to Catholic school.
And I am Don Guillory, author, historian, educator, co-host of this podcast. And I may or may not have had an exorcist moment of myself inside of a Catholic church when I was a young kid. But we'll get into that on this episode.
All right. So joining us today is author John Foster. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I think I'm the only non-Catholic in the group.
Well, I mean, currently there's a lot of non-Catholics in the group.
Oh, okay.
But,
Former.
you know. But yeah, man, tell us about yourself. What are you working on? What do you have out?
Sure. I've got 4 novels out at this point, 2 published by Gray Matter Press and 2 by Perpetual Emotion Machine Publishing, and also a collection of short stories by Perpetual, and a bunch of short stories scattered over magazines, etc. I've got my first crime. They've all been horror stories, horror books. My first crime novel is coming out this year from Gray Matter. It's called Rooster, and it'll be out this fall. And yeah, and then there's another horror novel called Archibald Leach, the Many-Storied Man, and I can't really say anything more except that should come out after Rooster.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited.
You came to my attention because of Gray Matter. I'm a big fan of everything Gray Matter does. So
yeah, they're great.
So that's where I first learned about you, and of course Tony over there has been very good to us and very good to the horror community altogether. Nothing against Perpetual. I just don't know much about them. So it's not like me saying I don't want to talk about them.
They're very terrible, very mean people. No, they're wonderful too. Yeah, I'm gifted in who I'm able to work with.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, of course, as always, we let the guest pick the film, and you chose The Exorcist. Would you like to tell us why you chose it?
No.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Moving along.
Sorry.
I was so hoping you would say that so I could do that.
There are a couple of reasons that I chose this. The first is that for me, I think it is not only the scariest horror movie that I've ever seen, but probably the horror movie of the highest quality that I've ever seen. I think you can argue that maybe a movie like Kubrick's The Shining is up there. Rosemary's Baby is fantastic, but I think the Exorcist is the apex. And back when I was younger and a little wilder, I sort of did an experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with Ozzy Osbourne used to do drugs. And,
what?
Yeah, I know. And
Hold on a second.
Yeah, did I just break some news?
Continue.
So he used to do drugs, and apparently he did an experiment for like a year where he took acid every day, which would explain some things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I decided during this sort of wild, sort of, post-divorce in Los Angeles, go to bed at 6 a.m. years, that I would fall asleep every night. My goal was a year, but I have no idea how long I actually did it. But I would fall asleep every night with The Exorcist playing, like on the nightstand on my laptop. And so The Exorcist is very important to me. I feel like it's really wormed its way in and done a lot of damage. So that's why. Yeah.
Huh. Very interesting. Don, had you watched this before?
You know what? I don't recall watching it when I was younger, but I'd had so many references to it, in my preteen years, teen years, college, as far as it seemed like every year a movie or a TV show was referencing it and somewhere paying homage to it. I honestly couldn't tell you if I saw it originally. I'm sorry, I saw it all the way through when I was younger, but I know I haven't seen it in my adult life other than when we watched it before this episode. And everything I was watching was like, okay, yeah, I kind of remember this, but it was still one of those things where, as I watched it this time, without any of the pop culture references or links, I looked at it and was like, there's a lot going on with this movie, especially with the time it was released and the political situation, social issues, everything that's going on, even the gender roles or gender expectations that are in this film. I'm looking at it, with a different lens that I might not have gotten, obviously, if I saw this when I was like 8 or even 15 years old, because I was probably still watching Porky's at that point.
When you were 8?
Oh, I was guarantee you I was watching Porky's then.
Oh man, you had a nice childhood. I didn't get to see stuff like that.
I remember watching this my freshman year of college, so that's probably 22, 23 years ago. I don't remember watching it since then. And I don't know if the remastered version was just really good, but I was impressed with the quality. Mm-hmm. And I was impressed with how well the story holds up. Like, I think you could release this today and people would dig it, And not just because it's The Exorcist. I'm saying if it was completely new, I think people would be like, whoa, what was that? Especially a certain scene with a crucifix.
Jesus, yes.
So...
but this is a movie that it got 10 Oscar nominations and it won 2 Oscars. So including one of the
best screenplay, right?
Yeah, it was screenplay and I think sound design, which is interesting because actually, if you notice, because we rewatched it yesterday. I've seen it obviously a billion times, but I watched it specifically just to look at it through a different lens. And one thing I really noticed was, I think of the movie and I think of the iconic music that goes with it, that sort of scary, high-pitched music. But really, most of the movie has no music. And it's just the use of sort of regional sound that, I don't know, it's just brilliantly done. Just as a film, it's brilliantly done.
Absolutely. I'd agree with that. I also noticed how quiet it is in places. I feel like a lot of movies forget that silence works really well. You have some stuff like Insidious used it really well. But like for the most part, I feel like I feel like films try too hard to use music to tell us what to feel and forget that complete silence also tells you what to feel. So that was a really cool aspect of this for me.
I think a lot of movies, a lot of them are just, pablum, they're shit, but they also, sure, I think are aimed, they really speak down to their audience. And a movie that is using silence, or that has the patience of a movie like The Exorcist, and like a lot of 70s movies, it's expecting you to rise to the challenge. It's not going to give you a sugar rush every 5 seconds just to keep you entertained.
No, that makes sense. Don, do you have anything about the music before we move on?
I like the way that they did it because, as two of you pointed out, that whole aspect of having the music tell the story, it makes some scenes predictable. And I like the idea that having that silence there takes that aspect out to where, now you're concerned as far as is something going to happen, something not going to happen? Oh, it's just normal day, because they never do it the same way. So it's not, it's quiet and then some crazy shit happens. It might be quiet, nothing happens. Mm-hmm. And it's quiet and crazy shit happens. And it's quiet and, it's just going about your life. There were a couple of times where I actually thought I had a bad copy of the movie because I was like, why the hell did the sound go out? It drew me back in. I was like, man, this is okay. It's working. I'm still waiting for that big scene at the end, but I'm looking for the stuff that's taking place in this. But speaking of sound, the one thing that I found unsettling, and we'll probably come back to this, was with respect to technology. So that early MRI CAT scan that they had.
Oh yeah.
I'm sitting there I'm getting pissed off because if you've ever had a CAT scan, CT scan, MRI, and you've been inside of those things,
I never have.
This when it's open, it will just drive all levels of anxiety that you already have times 10. Mm-hmm. And I'm watching this and I'm hearing this noise. I'm thinking of this little girl who all she's being done is tested on for the first half of the film. And now you have to hear this sound and imagining, holy shit, this has to be torture for her. As opposed to me at the audience, this real loud, bothersome sound. She's having to sit there and go through all this shit and has no idea what's going on. How fucking scary can that be for her? But yeah, the sound for me, it worked.
That's one of the things because that scene and the Spinal Tap scene,
oh yeah,
just fucking rough. But that's one of the themes that they're pushing is that how sort of violent and intrusive and dehumanizing modern medicine can be. Mm-hmm. And this poor 12-year-old who's already suffering, and obviously they're trying to help, but it's just more suffering.
Does anybody know the cost of medical bills at this point?
That was my other thought at this moment. My first thought was like, how the hell is mom affording all this shit?
well, actually, if we want to talk about themes a little bit, that's one of the important themes. And Friedkin, the director, very deliberately will put two scenes back to back, and it'll be a scene with Chris, Ellen Burstyn, who's the famous movie star, who can afford.
Right.
A room full of doctors and all these machines and all that stuff. Meanwhile, you've got Damien Karras, who's this, Greek immigrant kid who's a priest who's got to take the train 4 hours north to go, wrap his mother's bandages on her legs.
Right.
And then, later she's stuck in a public sort of insane asylum. It's supposed to be Bellevue, but it's not actually Bellevue. But and it's just, hell. And so there's a real, sort of financial income class level difference that they really hammer home in the movie.
Yeah, because there's even that point where somebody says to him, like, oh, if you had been a psychiatrist or I forgot what type of medicine.
It's a doctor. Yeah.
Yeah, he says, if you'd done this, she'd be in a good facility. She'd be in a good place. You wouldn't have to worry about putting her in something like this.
Exactly.
And, as though it's his fault.
Right. It's his fault that he became a priest and, a priest and a psychiatrist as opposed to just a Fifth Avenue psychiatrist.
Right.
I didn't really notice it while I was watching it, but I don't think I was looking for it. But as you're saying it and I'm replaying everything in my head, they did a fantastic job of doing this while also not the story's not dependent on you understanding that, but it really affects the characters. And as I'm replaying it in my head, I'm like, holy shit, you're so right. That's amazing. So, yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to watch. Because Chris, She's a fascinating character in a lot of ways, but she's a high-strung movie star who's really rich and used to everyone doing everything for her. And if you watch the beginning of the movie when she first comes in, you're like, how many fucking people does she have working for her? She's one woman.
A lot.
And she's got there's a married couple who's the housekeeper and then like the handyman that lives there, like the old German couple. And she's got a driver, and then she's also got a personal assistant. And you're just sort of, it's really in your face how many people she has around her to do all the things for her as the movie goes on. Oh, excuse me. The one redeeming thing we see from her up front is that she clearly just adores her daughter. She genuinely loves her daughter, and it's very real. And as the movie goes on and people are coming in sort of to help the daughter, you notice that she's the one that gets them coffee. She's the one when the first time that Reagan barfs on Father Karras' shirt, Chris herself washes and irons it. And it's just very interesting. We're now getting into the realm of not her regular life, it's just taking care of her daughter, and suddenly she's a real person. It takes her because her money isn't important anymore.
Right.
Oh, that's great.
I thought so.
Don, what do you got for us?
Well, I'm glad that you brought in the whole aspect of her being a mother, because as I'm watching this, the historian, or at least my daytime job as an historian, I'm looking at this through the 1970s lens, because in the 1960s, you had economic changes, you had more married women, divorced women that were entering the workforce, and there's like this big spike at the midpoint of the 1960s. So we go from having one income households to two income households, and you have, again, more single mothers that are in the workforce. And people were complaining about, or people on the religious right were complaining about, how these women, these married women, or these single mothers were, bringing about the end of American society, or they were going to create these.
I think they're still about that. Yeah.
Oh, they're still doing it. But it was at one moment where they really got up to the front, because you had the National Organization of Women, the Women's Liberation Movement. You had the push for the Equal Rights Amendment. You had Roe versus Wade in 1973 when this film came out. So all these aspects of women becoming independent, financially, socially, politically independent, and also exercising bodily autonomy becomes a problem for people in the religious right. And I see it in this film several times. I could see someone complaining and saying, well, the reason why this woman's family is going to hell is because she's divorced, and because she's a single mother. And it's all these things where I could see someone who's watching it from that standpoint would be arguing that this is why this stuff has happened to this woman, and her family's falling apart, and it's allowing Satan to reach her home because she refuses to get a man to take care of her. She's independent because she works, she makes this money as an actress. Right. She can afford these handlers, nannies, housekeepers, handymen, drivers, things like that. And she's forgotten her way, quote unquote, forgotten her way as a woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because I was born in '69, but obviously I was 4 in '73, so I don't really remember things. I was learning how to trace the number 3 on a piece of paper. But yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, because when you mentioned bodily autonomy and shifting away from her to Reagan for a second, part of what's so obviously there are a couple of different levels going on with her. But one thing that's awful is that you were seeing a girl who's pre-sexual. Because she's 12, but she's a very innocent 12. And so you're seeing her defiled, and that's very sort of tough to deal with. But at the same time, we're also dealing with the fact that, she's got a little acne, she's beginning to change, and we're dealing with a society that isn't ready to confront a woman owning her own sexuality.
Exactly.
So you've got the mother who is independent, and, she can basically have whatever man she wants because she's so wealthy and all that. And then you've got the daughter going through this demonic stuff, but so much of the stuff is graphically sexual, what the demon is doing to defile her. But I think it's really throwing in the audience's face, a woman's sexuality. It's like, deal with it.
Yeah, that's a really cool point with respect to sexuality, because that's another aspect here. I kind of questioned while I was watching this film, and then even after watching it, what if it had been a little boy? Now, the idea that you're having this young innocent girl, she can be victimized in so many different ways, right? As far as her innocence is taken metaphorically, and it can be taken, it literally, through the way that the demon is attacking her body, controlling her sexual organs, things like that, and the gratuitous way that it's being done.
Right.
And I kind of question, with the same reaction that audiences had, which, involved things like people were claiming they had heart attacks and passing out, all this type of stuff from seeing that. I question, how would their reaction have been the same? And I guess the answer is no. But would their reaction have been the same if it had been a little boy who's, he pulls out his penis and basically says the same stuff as far as like, suck my cock, No, yeah.
Definitely not in the 70s, man. I mean, I do remember some of the 70s and certainly the 80s, and the gender norms were very different then from what they are now. But I don't even think now it would be the same. I think there's still in the lizard brain of our culture, we still see girls as more vulnerable in certain ways. It's just imprinted on our culture, and we haven't really completely moved past it yet.
We also don't accept females being aggressive. Like she's very aggressive, like obscenities and whatever else. And I think if you had a boy in this situation, it would be startling, but it wouldn't have the same effect. And I agree that wouldn't change if it was released today.
Yeah, I think a little boy who's, basically gone feral and is saying, fuck me, fuck you, and all that stuff, you'd say he's just lost his shit,
Right.
It just feels like a sort of the natural extension of violence that we sort of associate with males, and she has it in spades. Because Linda Blair is, especially just the actress herself, is just adorable. So
yes.
They really cast her well.
And they, like you said earlier, like they work hard to make her innocent. And so we're already accustomed to, like, if she had started out being like a little defiant jerk, this wouldn't be as big. But when she starts out like playfully stealing cookies and, all that kind of stuff, it's a huge shift, and that makes it way more traumatizing. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a scene where she's been brought into the doctor, and she starts doing some weird stuff, like he tries to take her temperature with a thermometer. He's explaining it, and she yanks that out of her mouth and says, "I don't want that." And then later, a nurse is doing something in the exam room, and she's just sort of like wandering around like she's really stoned. And then right after that, the doctor is meeting with Chris in his office and talking about the profanities. And I'm going to be profane here. And, the mother's like, well, what did she say? And he's like, well, I don't, she has a, very diverse vocabulary. She's like, well, specifically, what did she say? And she was like, keep your fingers away from my fucking cunt. And those words, and it's funny because the mother and the doctor sort of cover their mouths and sort of laugh a little bit because they're very uncomfortable. Right. But those words associated with that girl, holy shit. I mean, it's really shocking.
I was going to say, it's definitely shocking as far as the level of discomfort that the doctor and the mother have having that conversation. But I could imagine if we go back to, we've got the innocence within Reagan's character of, we hear all that stuff later on. But right. Imagine, what the reaction would be if we hit you early on with her, the doctor comes in to examine her and she says those words. It might be more shocking for the audience, but I think the right decision was made in the doctor going in like, hey, got something to tell you.
Yeah, I think just as storytellers, they sort of built us towards it very well.
Because I think it also works well because we don't get to see what Reagan's like while saying it.
Right.
So we don't have any context. Like she's probably not using her demon voice yet, but like there would be obvious tells that she's different. So not getting to see it is extremely useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think sort of linking to what we've been talking about, sort of female autonomy and sort of the society being uncomfortable with female sexuality is the strong messages about patriarchy in the film.
Right.
And how Chris, it's interesting. It doesn't cover every relationship because obviously, there's a male director on the film, but she sort of has more power than he does. And we see that early on. He's a drunk and infatuated with her. But when she needs help, she has to turn to the doctors. And, they're all just men telling her, well, it's the temporal lobe and this and that. And she's just seen her fucking kid flying off the bed.
Right.
And then she talks about split personality. And there's this one older doctor and he's like, well, there's only been, 10 cited cases. And it's just this little lady, don't tell us our business almost. I mean, it's not intentional on their part, but clearly we're the doctors, we're the men. And I think later there's a scene where there's like 10 doctors in a room and she's talking to them all. I think there's like one female doctor and they're all men. And so it's all just confronting the patriarchy. And then who does she have to turn to after that? The fucking priesthood, who are all men.
Yep. Right.
I was thinking about that when you said that she starts serving everybody. I was like, everyone she's serving is male.
Yep. Male. And also Kinderman, the detective, played by the amazing Lee Cobb.
Yes.
Again, she's giving him coffee and all that, but it's another male authority figure. And so patriarchy is just all over this film.
And I mean, that's so in tune with the time that this came out, whether it's Roe versus Wade or the sexual revolution or whatever else. Overall, society, and I would argue still is, but society at the time was very much entrenched in that. And it was an absolute war to try to change it.
Right.
And so it's interesting how they're able to add it to the film without it feeling very forced down your throat, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I found all that interesting.
Yeah, because there's never been that moment where it's like where it's been blatant in other films where they say something like, oh, you wouldn't understand this because you're what, there were movies even in the 70s and 80s that were still saying that shit.
That's a great example. That's exactly what I was trying to think of how to say. So thank you.
Yeah,
that's good.
But I like the way that it's so subtle that it becomes commentary upon it just by its presence as opposed to its. Again, it's like you guys said, it's being forced upon you to say like, oh, well, that's not what it really means. Yeah, he just told her to shut the hell up and she doesn't know anything.
Right. No, the sort of the patriarchy in the 70s is as present and as natural, and it's as unnecessary to comment on it as it is that it was fall in Georgetown, and so it was getting colder. We know it's fucking fall, so it gets colder. Winter's coming next. And we don't need to talk about it. It's just there. It's part of the atmosphere, which is just fascinating, especially because, again, the dominant character for the first part of the movie is Chris. And then the story really switches to the story of faith of Father Karras and the sort of classic archetype of the guy who's lost his faith. But that's a whole other interesting thing, too, if I can sort of segue to a different
theme. Please do.
Of course.
So I was doing a little bit of reading because it's obviously it's very clear that Friedkin. Well, actually, let me back up. So William Peter Blatty wrote the novel and wrote the screenplay, and William Friedkin, who later went on to win an Oscar for The French Connection. Actually, no, I think he was about to win the Oscar for The French Connection when he started to work on this. They had a big disagreement thematically, and that was. Blatty saw this in some ways as an apostolic tale in that it was sort of to lead you back. It was a story about returning to faith or finding faith. And Friedkin was like, fuck that. He was a much more modern person. But you can see the clash of, the modern science that fails, but the modern science and all the colors, and it's always brightly lit scenarios. And then you think about when you're dealing with Karras, and almost always it's dark, it's browns and, like dark burgundies and fall colors. Mm-hmm. And so there's just a real, like a clash in time. It feels like you're in different centuries. And then ultimately, the way the story goes is obviously modern science, for all our wonders, fails, and we must turn to the old powers. But what was happening in the country, obviously, was we were in many ways shaking off the bonds of religion. And of course, Christianity being the dominant religion. And I think it was in 1968. Actually, let me look at my notes. Yeah, it was 1968. Time magazine ran a cover that said, "Is God dead?" And in fact, that magazine cover shows up in Rosemary's Baby, which came out shortly before The Exorcist. So the country was dealing with the notion, this is not a Christian country. It's a secular country, and moving away from that. So this was an interesting story that maybe, I think from Blatty's perspective, is trying to push back and say, there are situations where we sort of need to reach for the old ways. For me, as a non-Christian and non-Catholic, I just sort of look at it as, you're looking back for the old, the Bene Grigri. It really has very little to do with religion and Christianity for me. That's just, this is the white power versus the black power. But I think there's a really interesting clash between secularism and religion in the film.
It still works really well together, and it almost makes it better, in my opinion. Like, provided that the things I'm thinking of actually line up with this.
There's a scene near the end. The exorcism is happening, and the two priests are really fucking exhausted. And they're both like sitting on the stairs outside of Reagan's room. And Karis is like, why did this happen? And I'm talking about the sort of the updated, revised version, the expanded version. And there's the scene there where Karis says, "Why a little girl? Why would it do this?" And Father Marin, played by the amazing Max von Sydow, who sadly passed away just recently. But he says it has something to do with, destroying our dignity and making us think that we're animals and we're not worthy of the love of God. That scene was cut from the original film by Friedkin. So the theatrical version of the film did not have that. He didn't want to deal with that bullshit. He wanted to leave it as more of, it was just the demon got out of the cave and found a girl and fucked her up. And it just happened, and that's the thing. And Blatty really wanted more of an explanation, again, that apostolic sort of thing to lead you back towards faith. So in the restored version, it's back in. But I actually think it's a great scene, so I'm sort of glad it's back in. But
yeah, so do I. I had no idea that was cut. That's interesting. Huh. Yeah, I think that's a great scene. What about you, Don? Do you like that scene or not?
I did, but it's one of those things of I don't recall seeing it without it, so it becomes a thing of not being able to compare it. But yeah, I do like the way that it ties things together.
I just like that it shows what a toll it's taking on these two.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny because I love, present day stuff like John Constantine and things like that. I mean, I really geek out over that stuff. But the whole notion of, like how Constantine does an exorcism, it's basically he casts a spell and knocks the thing out.
Right.
And when you watch these guys, it's an enormous, grueling battle to maintain your faith under the assault of this demon. And they talk about how Father Marin had done an exorcism in Africa before, like 10 years before the story happens or something like that. And then it had gone on for months. And can you imagine doing this for months and actually sort of maintaining the psychological balance to keep yourself open to faith so that you can, as it is in the mythos of this story, you're basically, it's not you that's casting the demon out. You are a channel for the power of God. And so you need to keep your head in the right place. And I just think it's fascinating to think about things like that. The only recent film that I can think of that handled it that well was maybe like 15 years ago, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Have you seen that? Okay.
I have not.
It's a damn good movie. Really good cast, but there's the exorcism in that is grueling and tough and not to the extent of this because the story goes in a very different direction. Actually, quick funny side note on that story. So I went to see a matinee of that in New Hampshire, and it was one of those giant stadium theaters. There's like 1 billion seats, and the movie had just started. So I walk in and things are fucking pitch black. I can't see anything, and I sort of get up to the middle of the stadium, and I move in towards the middle of the row, and I sit down, and I'm watching the movie, and the first time, like, there's enough light to see around and my eyes have adjusted, I realize that I'm seated there's one seat between me and the only other person in the theater is an old woman. And to this day, I would like to apologize to that woman because she must have been terrified. Because she scared me, so I can only imagine that I scared her. So I got up and I moved quickly,
Yeah. At least you didn't sit in her lap. I mean,
well, Jesus, and I didn't even see her, so I could have. I mean, that would have been horrible. I mean, funny later, but not good then.
This would have been a great, hey, let me tell you what met my wife.
She was like 80.
No. I mean, I'm just like, that would be one of those cute stories where you kind of like, hey, yeah, I was in there and didn't see her, sat down on her lap, but hey, kids, we've been married for 30 years.
We still don't know what that movie was about.
After she got out of Traction.
Traction, that's a great way to lead into something here. I've always heard how Linda Blair broke her back in this.
Oh.
And it's one of the scenes where she's on the bed and thrashing around, and the way they held her down, like something snapped in her spine.
Holy shit.
And yeah. And then so today I was reading that the mom, I don't remember the actress's name, I'm sorry.
It's Ellen
Burstyn, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Apparently she somehow also hurt her spine filming this. And I think that's so crazy that they both have this injury.
There was one with the Linda Blair one. There's something that I remember reading where it was on the bed. So I mean, a lot of the scenes for her are tied down to the bed. So yeah. But I guess something was wrong with how she was tied down or held down, and it actually hurt her. But they didn't realize it because her line at the moment was "make it stop."
Yeah.
And so people didn't realize she was hurt. And then I had read this other thing because Friedkin was sort of an asshole. Like everyone that came off that shoot was like, yeah, that was a really tough movie. I mean, people would quit the set and all sorts of stuff. But so Ellen Burstyn at one point, she gets like psychic power yanks her across the room or something. And she complained that it was too hard. So Friedkin said, okay. And they were going to do another take. And he goes over to the psychic puller guy, whoever's using the machine that does that. And he says, do it harder. So they did it harder, and she actually screamed in pain, and that's the take they used.
Wow.
And that's where she injured her back as well.
Is that okay? Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, when she's getting pulled across. I just pulled it up to look at it. But yeah, apparently the set also caught fire.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah. I read about the set catching on fire, and they had injuries because of that.
That's
the
so
set
crazy.
Caught fire. I know that the relatives of a couple of people died. Miller, the guy who played Father Karras, his son was almost killed, like a motorcycle hit him or something like that, but he didn't die. But I think some people died on set too, but I can't remember. I just know that, I mean, it's one of those movies that they like to, all this crazy shit happened around The Exorcist.
Oh, here it is. When filming one of the possession scenes, Linda was thrown out of the bed when a piece of the rigging broke, causing her to injure her back. Additionally, after the film's release, Linda received so many death threats that the studio had to hire bodyguards to escort her for the next 6 months.
Jesus.
Can I just say how much I hate people?
Yeah.
Fuck.
You know what?
You can never say it enough.
It's funny because the church, like capital C, had sort of split reactions, and the American church tends to be pretty conservative, and so like the bishops here, and there might have been some cardinals involved in what I'm going to say, but I'm just going to call them all bishops. So the bishops here were all bitching and bishoping, and the bishop in Boston and New York, they were railing, this is offensive, it's blasphemy, yada yada. Meanwhile, there was some dude over like in Spain or Portugal, who thought it was so positive for Catholicism, because it really shows Catholicism in a good light, that he got permission to hold his own screening over in Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's just a crazy difference of how people looked at it, because it really is a pro-Catholic film.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, because even Father Karras at the end, you see how it's this priest who sacrifices himself to save everybody. It's like, oh, well, you're going to possess, I'm going to beat the demon out of you. Demon can come into my body, and then boom, I'm going to kill myself before he can get anybody else. So the church is seen as the only option to actually help, because you use medicine, up to date science, the latest technology to try and help this girl, and none of that works. But the exorcism works.
Well, the exorcism, actually, this is an interesting point, because I would have agreed with you 100% until about 2 hours ago, and I just read a little article. I thought, that's an interesting thing. I know, I shouldn't read. But because I always look at that, I think, Karis is a wonderfully heroic character. And, I mean, just masterful. And the acting is so good. But there was a guy who was, oh, fuck me, I'm going to forget it, on exorcisms or knows about exorcisms, who actually explained to the interviewer that actually Karis fails at the end. When he says to the demon, come into me, he has forgotten the power of God. He has despaired and given the power of God to win. And so he calls it into him and then destroys himself. So I look at it as heroism, but I guess from that sort of like theological point of view, he's strayed from the path. You're supposed to be the vessel for this, white magic coming through, and he decided that it wasn't going to work, so he found another path.
Huh.
I can definitely see that now.
Well, and when you add in the Catholic belief that suicide automatically leads to hell,
right,
no matter the reasons.
Right. I mean, it's a hell of a sacrifice, but
yeah.
But he despaired, because that's one of the things that Father Merrin, the old guy, is telling the young priest, Karis, is that, you can't despair. It wants you to despair. And so at the end, in a way, Karis has despaired that it will work. And I guess so from the theological perspective, I think that holds true. From the other perspective, I look at it as they've established early on that he's a fighter. The root of his character, he's a boxer, he's a scrapper. Yeah. And I think, when push came to shove and the real exorcist is dead, he found his own way. This is the way that Damien Karis is going to kick some ass.
With him gone and Karis has the demon, I was sitting there going, who else is going to stop this? It's
right.
Not like he could take it in and then wait till the next team shows up at shift change.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense in that way, because Karis is not up to the task. So... But still, I guess, with a religion as rigid as Catholicism that says no matter what reason you're going to, doesn't matter why you kill yourself, you're still going to hell. He looked at this and, said, I can't do it. The power of God will not work through me enough. But that's despair. He's just surrendered. That's the spiritual fight, and he's just surrendered. So I think that's the point that the guy, the real Catholic dude, was making.
Interesting.
It's funny, though, with all this stuff, because it's all Catholic Christianity and all that. And Pazuzu is actually Mesopotamian.
Yeah.
And so those spirits and demons and whatnot, we're casting this in the sort of Judeo-Christian good versus evil sort of concept and paradigm. But that's not at all how they were seen in Mesopotamia. That's just not how thinking went. And so Pazuzu actually was, like, I don't know, King of the Wind demons or something like that. But people would use Pazuzu as a ward against other demons. So Pazuzu was bad. It was dangerous, evil, yucky stuff. But you could use this dangerous, evil, yucky stuff to get rid of other evil, yucky stuff. And there was this one demoness, Lamashtu, who I guess her specialty was like eating pregnant women or something awful like that. But Pazuzu would chase her off. So it's really just interesting that this has all been taken into this very Western American good versus evil Christianity paradigm. But that's not what these creatures or characters or whatever they are actually were in Mesopotamia back when they were created or first identified or named or whatever you believe.
Well, and that speaks to the Western. I'll just stick with American because typically Europeans know a little bit more. But yeah. the Western experience, speaking of the United States, with any religion that's not Judeo-Christian.
Right.
So if it happens to be an ancient religion, an indigenous religion, anything like that, it's always, hey, these are the absolutes, good, evil. Never any shit that's in between or anything that's just, somehow nuanced or vague. And having taught, at least for undergrad and even in high school, when you get to the students and start talking about things like Quetzalcoatl with the Aztecs or, the always required Greek, ancient Greek religion, you start telling things you're like, oh, yeah, Zeus was king of, the king of all the gods. And then you start talking about all the shit that Zeus is doing. You're like, God damn, Zeus is a fucking asshole.
He was an asshole and just talk about a womanizer. Man.
Yeah. And a rapist. I'm sitting here like, I said, this guy is all this stuff, but he's supposed to be the best. But it was one of those things where my students started to open their eyes about it like, yeah, other than the Thunderbolt, I don't give a shit about Zeus. I mean, he's a horrible father, a horrible husband, horrible everything. So, I mean, it makes sense that movie would, at least from our standpoint, from the American standpoint of, if it's foreign, it's got to match up with whatever we say. It's good or bad. There's nothing in between. There's no redeeming value. It's one or the other. Well, and it has to deal with our ignorance in the world.
You could probably speak to this better than I can, but that's also actually historically what Christianity did to the deities of other religions as we took over various, or I say we, but as the religion spread into different regions, it'd say, okay, your god is Baal, so now we're going to make it the demon Baal. And that's why you can just sort of work it in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then we can sit here and say, they worship demons. Look at that. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be with them. Come give money to my church.
That's right. In terms of cultural impact in cinema, as we've already touched on a little bit, this movie has influenced everything. And I was chatting with a buddy of mine who has some kids, and they thought it was slow and predictable because they've seen all the things, but they don't realize that all those things that they've seen came because of this movie.
Right.
This was the first rock in the water, and those are all the ripples out that they've been seeing for decades since this thing came out, which is just sort of interesting.
I think I fall into that category. Like I said, I hadn't seen it in, 20, 23 years, something like that. And I was bored at parts. I was just like, let's get to the fun stuff. I know what's coming, and I have that same issue with Psycho sometimes. Like, I get why Psycho was terrifying at the time, and I love Psycho, but I totally understand, like, I'm not going to have my kids watch Psycho. They'd be like, what the fuck is this?
It's almost like the way American audiences watching American football get really bored watching soccer.
Okay.
Yeah,
because
I can see that.
Because there's almost no scoring in soccer, and there's lots of scoring in American football.
Yep.
And so a modern audience is used to faster, lots of music and all that sort of stuff. And this movie was made in the 70s. And the 70s, I mean, I think the 70s is the best era of filmmaking that this country's had. But if you're not, I guess, of a certain age, or if you're not like a real cinephile, they are slower movies. They really are patient. They take a long time to get there. And that's part of why they can have really great effects. But they can be fucking boring in places, I mean, especially if you've been raised on something, that's just, it gets to the point a lot faster.
Well, James and I have talked about it before as far as how some movies have a slow burn. This is a movie that has a slow burn that works, even if they might not have been intending for it to be that slow burn and that build. But it has that slow burn that works, whereas some movies have that slow burn and there's no payoff at all.
Right.
Yeah.
We talked about injuries earlier, and I mentioned this briefly, but the idea that this movie in 1973 was so shocking for some people, there were a lot of injuries and medical conditions attributed to the film for audience members, as far as the amount of people who went in, had heart attacks or claimed to have a heart attack,
right.
Dizziness, fainting spells, miscarriages, what was it called? Cinematic neurosis. That was one of the terms that I saw, where people were just
I question
freaking
this.
out from seeing this. Well, I do too, because the same thing happened when Interview with the Vampire came out, one of the Friday the 13th, and I saw it as, well, this has to be marketing associated with it. But
it sounds like marketing. Yeah.
Yeah. But considering what was included in this film, and with it being 1973, I could see people like, oh, that movie's way too fucking much for me, and getting up and walking out, or maybe vomiting because of something that's there. Some of us are really sensitive to vomit. It's and seeing it on the screen, there were a couple of times where she throws up right in the priest's face, and I just started laughing. I mean, 2020, I'm laughing at this now, as opposed to if I was a kid watching this, or when I was a kid watching this, I'm thinking like, holy shit, this is disgusting. That's
really
horrible.
gross.
I'm gonna watch more.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is marketing bullshit, because other films have done stuff like that. I think was it William H. Castle who did a lot of Vincent Price stuff, and he would do shit like that. You need to sign a waiver, get a check from your doctor before you go see The Tingler.
We actually talked a lot about it in our episode on 13 Ghosts.
Oh, neat.
When we did that, the whole intro is about William Castle and the crazy shit he did.
Yeah.
So, guys, definitely go check that out. But yeah, continue.
I will. So yeah, I think it mostly was marketing, but I can see people being very shocked. I can see people leaving. I know that if you've ever seen, not Butch Cassidy, what's the Bonnie and Clyde?
Okay.
When Bonnie and Clyde, if you've never seen it, with Warren Beatty and I think it's Faye Dunaway.
Right.
At the very end of the movie, they're caught by the law and they're basically shot to pieces. I mean, they're dancing. They can't even fall. So many bullets are ripping them to pieces. And apparently just we are so jaded at this point, but people had not seen that on film. And it really shocked people. People were just stunned by how violent it was. So I can see scenes in this. And from something I read, especially like that Spinal Tap scene where they're injecting the thing in her neck and the blood's shooting out a little tube and she's obviously in agony, and that it was just it left people very distraught.
Yeah, I mean, and even the crucifix, when I was watching it this time, I knew it was coming and I was still like, ooh, like it's
kind of a holy shit moment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's done fantastically, but it's the violence she's doing it with,
Right.
There's nothing sexual about this.
Oh, no,
anybody out there who says she's masturbating with a crucifix, you should go fuck yourself, because I don't know what kind of masturbation you think you're doing, but holy shit, stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is right.
It was nothing more than stabbing herself with it. It is all I got from it. Because again, I was waiting for that scene because I went back and read for the stuff to look for, things that I might need to focus in on. And they're like, oh, audiences were turned off or upset and vomiting and passing out from one of the more gratuitous scenes where she masturbates with a crucifix. And I got to that scene. I'm like, what the fuck were they seeing? That's not what I saw at all. She was stabbing herself, presumably in the vagina, or in the location of her vagina, stabbing herself and attacking herself, or the demons attacking her body.
Right. It was defilement. There was nothing about pleasure in this. Yeah.
But I mean, I was thinking about how that still got me, right? And this is 50 years later, and I watch this shit for fun all the time. I eat breakfast and watch Saw,
Right.
So then I'm looking at if my mom had gone to this movie in 1973, I wouldn't be here. She would have had a heart attack for legit. Okay. And, so stuff like that, I could see people getting up and leaving over that, being that offended by it. Yeah. Not necessarily that grossed out by it, but definitely that offended by it or wanting their money back.
One thing I and I'm totally wedded to the idea, and I'm absolutely 100% right, that the 70s are the best era of filmmaking for the United States. But the 70s don't flinch. When they go in to show you something, they show you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's the movie? I'm just blanking on the name. It's Ned Beatty and John Voight and Burt Reynolds.
Deliverance.
Deliverance. Thank you. The problem is that we forget what a great movie that actually is because all you think about is the scene.
Right.
But, that was done in the 70s, and you see the scene. It's not like a euphemism. It's not happening off camera. It's the horror, and it goes on for a lot longer than you want it to go on. And it's just one of the things I love about that decade. The audiences were much more squeamish than the filmmakers were. In fact, there was a lot of stuff done in the 70s that you could never do today. And I don't mean just in terms of race. I just mean in terms of, because obviously that was an issue, but just stories that you would tell or things that you would show in the 70s. If you've ever seen Jodie Foster did a movie when she was very young called The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. Have you seen that?
No, but I remember, what was it, the Blue Lagoon? That had something similar with the nudity and sexuality between kids.
Yeah. Well, The Little Girl That Lives Down the Lane is not really sexual, but it's basically, like this girl is like 10 and she's living on her own and she's trying to hide it from various adults and eventually ends up like killing some people and all that. And boy, would they not do a movie like that now.
It sounds great. I'm going to go check this out.
It's really good. It's really good. It is, again, it's a 70s movie, so it's a little slow. But you've got Martin Sheen playing this really gross, sort of aggressive creep, so he's awesome.
That's not the Sheen I'm used to that being a reference to.
This was before he ran for office.
Cleaned himself up, got in the West Wing.
It's obviously it's where Charlie got it from.
This movie itself had a budget of $12 million. It, I guess, adjusted for inflation, the box office was around $440 million, but it was known as had the record as being the highest grossing R-rated movie for about 18 years until Terminator 2 Judgment Day came out in 1991. And even when it came out, it had some trouble. It was able to convince the MPAA to go from an X rating, or at least avoid an X rating, and get the R rating. But there were some other issues as far as like making sure that children wouldn't go see the movie. I think the Great Britain, they actually banned the movie from home video release up until about 20 years ago. And I'm sure there have been some other things that have happened with relation to the film. I like the fact that earlier we discussed about how the Catholic Church, I wouldn't say necessarily endorsing it, but definitely benefiting from it because of the way that some people could see the film. And we all know they could use some good press right now.
So all of my notes are exhausted, and I believe you guys are there as well, correct?
Correct.
Spent.
Cool. So we will go ahead and wrap this up. John, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I definitely only watched The Exorcist because you wanted to do it. So I'm glad that I saw it again after all these years. I don't know. Exorcism movies aren't usually one of my favorite things. They're something I tend to avoid because so many of them are not good, shall we say.
They're not good.
And it was better than I expected. And yeah, I'm glad we talked about it. The social commentary on this is ridiculous. And I learned a lot from you. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
But yeah, so where can we find you online?
You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. And my website is johnfosterfiction.com.
Perfect. Very cool. All right. Well, Don, you got anything else?
Yes. My book, my latest nonfiction, Bastards of the Bayou, is available Amazon, Kindle, and I'm sure you can get it at any book retailer near you. So if you are looking for a nice down south suspense thriller, be sure to check it out.
And my next book, The Cassowary, will be out within the next 22 years. I'm currently enjoying my new job as a stay-at-home kindergarten teacher, and let's just say I haven't had a lot of time to write. All right, so we'll wrap this up. As always, I am James Sabata.
And I am Don Guillory.
And we'll see you next week here on thenecronama.com.